One of the things I also tell people who are starting out, because it can feel daunting, right? You direct a feature film or you show run a TV show, budget of like many tens of millions of dollars. But at the end of the day, the job is not different than if you're making a short film or you're writing a script. Like the job is the same. You're just making the best creative choices that you can given the limitations.
But I would love to go back and understand a little bit about what was the first thing that really made you fall in love with this medium, that made you want to become a filmmaker, a writer? I mean, you do a little bit of everything, but what was it early on that really drew you in to want to get involved in this medium?
When I was growing up, I grew up outside of Boston, and I wanted to be a comic book artist when I was a kid. And so I would do this thing where I would, draw these like superheroes, and it was like, I think it was called Ultra Task Force, and it was like a military strike team. And I was drawing the characters, and I started drawing the book. And then I was like, well, someone's got to put all these words in these balloons. So I was like, well, maybe I'll try that. And that was really how I started writing, is kind of being forced to, because I was like, oh, I'm going to have to come up with a plot if I want to draw all these cool images. And I found it really fun. I think that at the time, just to be able to do something with like a pencil and a pen and a piece of paper, it was really empowering. And to be able to tell those stories. And when I started getting into high school, there were a couple things that really blew my mind. And one was, I was in an English class, and a teacher showed us The Graduate, which I had never seen before. And he had this really interesting way of showing it to us kids. He put in the VHS tape, and then every like 10, 15 seconds, he would pause it and be like, well, you notice that the color in this scene, or like, look at the staging and look at the camera angle, look at the wardrobe, look at the lighting, look at the mood of the scene. And I'd always been a fan of movies, but I never really broken down the craft in that way, or had that craft broken down for me in that way.
Wow.
And so I started thinking like, wow, there's so many tools at your disposal when you are filming something. And also, when you're drawing a comic book, you have to draw like hundreds of pages of like little drawings. And I was very lucky in that in my high school, there was an AV department where you could borrow a camera, and they also had an editing deck. And I just was like, well, if I could do this when I was drawing with just a pen and a paper, I think I could do this if I have a camera and an editing deck. And so I started writing scripts and roping my friends into acting in movies. And in high school, soup to nuts, I wrote and directed and edited, I think it was like 2 features and a bunch of short films. It was really like my passion at the time. And it was just nice to have something that I did that I was really cared about. And I was raised by a single mom. It was just me and my sister, and she was working all the time. So one of the things she would do is she would drop us off at Barnes and Nobles after school, and I would just spend the whole day like reading through the film section, looking at directors and really understanding better like what the camera was as a tool and what words on a page were, and how best to tell kind of like increasingly personal stories.
Yeah, man. I mean, just getting that little breakdown of how you got started, it sounds like it was the images, it was the comic books and the images, and then it kind of moved over to what is the underneath part of that, the actual story that drives it, which is so beautiful, because look at all the things you've done. You're in animation, comic book studio, everything. But what I would love to kind of dig into a little bit is, you obviously have such an extreme passion for this, and that's so cool, getting The Graduate broken down for you, like at an early age like that.
Mm-hmm.
That must have made like a big impact for that movie too, but you obviously very passionate about this, but what do you think it was, or what was it that drove you to take that action, that like making 2 feature films when you're in high school, and you were a leader, you were the one who was the leader, bringing your friends together, having a vision. What do you think it was that kind of really pushed you to want to make that step? Because in our community, some of the questions we get, that's one of the biggest things that it seems like hinders people, is not having the confidence, or maybe not having the belief, or just not having that vision for like, what, I can do this, I can take the action. But you did. I mean, you just went out and started taking action and making it happen. So I don't know, what was like that? What do you think it was that really pushed you to take that actual next step, which really started the momentum,
It's a really good question. And it's one that I've talked to a lot of like filmmakers who are starting out, because a lot of times somebody will be like, oh, I made a short film. I don't know what's going to happen with it. I don't know if it's going to get into festivals. We've already gotten some rejections. And I always say to them the same thing, which is, you made a movie. Like, that is not an easy thing to do. You wake up and have that in your mind that you want to make a movie, and you go out and you do it. You organized it. You were clearly passionate enough to do it. And that to me is the most important part of it. You can always get better at it. You can always trial and error, tell different types of stories. But the fact that you went out and did it, that is baked into your DNA. And that's something that I'm always impressed. Just the fact that somebody went out and did it. Like, listen, did I make some really terrible short films? Do I want to like show my 2 high school features to anybody? No. But the fact is that I look back and I say, like, wow, I am proud of myself for picking up a camera and saying, like, oh no, this is something I can do. This is something I want to do. And this is something I'm going to see through.
Yeah.
And I think at the time, I was like a relatively emo kid and trying to figure out what was the medium that I wanted to tell stories in. And, I look back and I went to my childhood room the other day, and there's just stacks of composition notebooks of just like movie ideas and, doodles and like little dumb concepts. And there was just something inside me that felt like I wanted to express something, even if I didn't know what exactly it was. And even when I knew that I wasn't like necessarily particularly good at it when I started out. One of the ways I think about things is a bit of like a numbers game. I knew that I wanted to get into indie film and I wanted to be successful as a filmmaker. But I also knew that there were a lot of people trying to do that. And if I could just separate myself from the pack through repetition and a numbers game of like, I was like, oh, God, like a lot of people do one thing and then they give up, or it's hard. And I knew that it was going to be hard, and it was hard. I mean, that's certainly something that I am very honest about on social, about failures and things that didn't work out the way that I wanted them to. Yeah. But the fact is that I knew that in order to be successful for me, because I really didn't think that I was like naturally the most talented at filmmaking, but I knew that I had a relatively high pain tolerance. And I saw the way that my mom worked in order to raise me and my sister, and just how relentless it was. And I was like, if I want to become good at this, it's not going to happen right away. And it didn't, I don't think I'm learning things every day, but even to the point where I even thought that I was, from the time I started work until the time I got any recognition, which was my short at Sundance, it was 11, 12 years of working with almost nothing to show for it.
Wow. But you have that. This is something that often comes up in these interviews and I'd love to get your like philosophy of this concept. It's something I don't hear many people talk about, but to me, it seems very interesting, which is I've noticed a common trait in successful people who have made things happen and done great work. And like you've said, you had the discipline, but the self-awareness to me seems to be such an important aspect. And it sounds to me, you were very self-aware, even at a very early age. Like the fact that you were able to put 2 and 2 together and have that realization of there's so many people doing this that it can't be about the talent, really. It's going to be about the discipline and the rest. I'd love to just get your thoughts a little bit about self-awareness and like, what does that mean to you in your daily life? Obviously you must be very self-aware doing everything you're doing now, and also having the mindset that you're always learning. Like you just said, it's no matter how much success, I'm always growing and always learning. But I'd love to hear a little bit about self-awareness and how can people just getting started out try to get a little bit more in tune with themselves to really understand what they need to do, specifically for them.
A very strange combination of things happened when I was younger, which was, my mom was an orphan and she worked really hard and she was good at school. And that was the only reason why she was able to come to the US. Oh. And she really had to, when you're the child of immigrants, it's such a crazy thing, right? To see your parent and know that they had to have it in their mind that they wanted to move across the world and to bend reality to create the life that they wanted for themselves and especially for their kids. And she made one really great decision early on, which was because school was always important to her and that's how she escaped the situation she was in, she looked at a magazine when I was like 4 or 5 and was like, I want to find out what the best school is in the Boston area. And she just called Milton Academy, which was like a prep school. And I went in and I tested into the school. Me and my sister ended up being like financial aid kids there. But, you know, growing up in the Chinese community, I think that there was a certain path that people wanted for their kids. And at an early age, I was really exposed to a lot of kids who did not have a limitation because their parents were very successful, very rich. And I was like, well, that should be the expectation that I have for myself, is succeeding at that level and not taking anything less than that. And I also, in order to do that, she still had to pay 50% of the tuition, but it was for her, you know, that's a huge cost it was a huge cost for us, frankly. And, but I saw how hard she worked. And I also watched as she did these things that I thought were, you know, she has a really high pain tolerance and a very high, capacity for not letting failure deter her. And we had to have that in order to survive when we were kids. And, you know, there were times where I would watch her literally sit in the kitchen and make 100 cold calls for real estate. And 2, people would be like, yeah, let's meet. Maybe I do want to sell my house. Send out 1,000 mailings and get 1 answer or something like that. And for me, I knew, because I knew that I mean, again, like, I don't think of myself as, oh, I was like the most talented and like ever. Of course, if I make a short film, it's going to do great. It was always like, I know I'm going to have a certain level of failure that is going to be consistent in order for me to have something that breaks through. And I think that that's really important to know when you're starting out, because, you know, it's one thing to make 100 phone calls in one afternoon and you can find out whether or not, you know, your success rate is like 2% or something like that. But you make a short film every few months and then spend another year submitting it to festivals. You don't necessarily see the light at the end of the tunnel.
No.
But the light is there. And the light is not something that is external. I think the light is something that is inside of who you are and like what you're able to take. Meaning, if you can know and you can look at what you're doing and be honest with yourself about what you did right and what you did wrong, there's always a pathway forward. And, you know, I told this story on Twitter a few years ago, mainly because I wanted to help people who are starting out, because I remember how painful that time was when I didn't have any clarity on whether I was doing the right thing. And, you know, when I graduated from college, I made a schedule for myself. Same thing I did in high school, to direct a short film every 6 months, a no budget short film, like $100 budget, $200 budget. Do it every 6 months and then write a feature film every 9 months. And I did that for 3.5 years. I ended up making 12 short films, and 11 of them never got into any film festivals. But even the 12th one didn't. The 11th one, called Window Breaker, I made it for $600, shot it in my childhood home. My mom is in it. Kids who act in it are kids from the neighborhood in Boston. And, you know, on a $600 budget, that got into Sundance. And that was the first time where I was like, okay, something is happening. I know it's not the be all end all, but at least I have some confirmation that I was doing something right. Yeah. But before that, it was really hard. You know, it was a lot of waking up every night, middle of the night, being like, am I doing the right thing? This is ever going to end? Or am I just going to continue to be churning this stuff out and getting rejected from film festivals and not having anyone care? Yeah. And it's that moment that I'm most concerned about for people who are starting out, because again, that time period is still very visceral for me. I really remember it. And even as you're talking about, like, I know that you know a lot of people who are in that moment. And that's a really hard moment. And luckily I'm through that moment, but looking back on it, I want to encourage people to know that as long as first off, if they are creating something that they care about, that is a big deal. And that is an achievement in and of itself, even if nothing happens with it. And as long as you're getting better at it, that pathway is the correct pathway. It's just very hard to see it until there's some confirmation from an external source.
Yeah, man, there's so much good stuff in there. Like, wow. I mean, first off, it's so beautiful how much of an impact your mom had on you, and that like example that she set with her discipline and her, pushing through the failure. And it's obviously that is such an important thing, is being able to push through the failures, or even like you just said, it's not even necessarily a failure. It's really about your perception of it. And if you learn something from it and push through it. But when you were like, when you're in the midst of that hard, rough period, and that's awesome that you set a set schedule for yourself too. That's such good advice for anyone here too. Like, actually set a schedule for yourself and try your best to stick to it. But what was the thing that was it the storytelling aspect that was fulfilling you the most to keep going with it? Just the actual creation of these stories? I'd love to hear a little bit about, like, how do you even come up with ideas? Like, what is that process like for you? Because that's another question we get all the time, obviously, is that people have a really hard time honing in on ideas. But first, like, during that process, what was the thing that kept pushing you to keep going, other than the goal that you have at the end of the tunnel, that light? But what was the thing, like, in the middle of it that really kept you going? Was it like the story and the creation aspect of it?
To me, whether it's a movie or a TV show or a short film, like, the process of creation is magic. I mean, you're with a bunch of people, you point the camera in a direction, and then it's recorded, and then you edit it together with music or whatever it is, and then it exists, and then people just see it. They see the story without all the other stuff around it. Like, it rained that day, we had to move indoors, or like, an actor didn't show up, an actor got a haircut because he's in college and didn't even think that he couldn't get a haircut in the middle of a shoot, And then that always kept me going. Was just, I loved, even when I knew that I wasn't expressing something in a way that was connecting with people, the process of expressing something was really magical to me. And it was something that I kept on wanting to go back to. And, I also just feel like, again, like, I was a pretty emo kid. I still am. I probably, you can tell, like, I'm like relatively, I have like a lot of big feelings, and it's like, having those go someplace was really therapeutic. And, I've been doing this since I was 15, 16 years old. And so that is the place where I live. That is the place where I really feel energized and excited about something.
Yeah. I mean, I love you saying that, like, the idea that the process can be like therapy for you is such a beautiful philosophy that is, no matter what stage you're at, anyone can partake in that. Like, it's not about the success at that point. It really is just about the process. And I think that's what we have to attach to when we're really first getting started, But I would love, I mean, there's so many different directions I could go with this. Like, there's so many questions I want to ask you, but I would love to hear a little bit about, like, what advice can you give people with the magical process of ideas, capturing ideas? And then how do you start to develop an idea? Like, when do you know an idea is one that you want to run with? And then what are those, like, next steps for you?
Really good question. And, I've had things happen a bunch of different ways. There's a way that I think a lot of people have experience, which is, you come up with an idea and you really like it, and then you write it, and then it's, and then it's a script. And that stuff happens naturally. There were times where there was a moment where something happened, and that night I went home and I wrote out a whole outline for a feature or something like that. That, to me, is not the concern. The concern is when you're sitting there and you're like, oh, I feel like I don't have any ideas right now. And so Yep. What I do when that happens is I give myself permission to come up with bad ideas. And I will sit down for a week, maybe 2 weeks, and write out 10 ideas a day. It does not matter if they're good or bad. Sometimes I'll only get 5. Sometimes I'll get 15. Sometimes it's actually fun. Like, you write out an idea and it's like, oh, this is terrible, but that's one of my 10 ideas. Maybe down the road, I'll come back to it. And I just have like a Google Doc that has all these ideas that sometimes, something like my comic book, 7 Deadly Sins. That was an idea I came up with 4 or 5 years before I actually turned it into a comic book. I was like, okay, it's kind of interesting. It's not for right now. But then as I started reading about the history of post-Civil War Texas, I was like, this actually has some themes in it that I want to revisit. And so it's just nice to have like a repository of ideas that I can return to. But again, it's like a little bit of a numbers game of just like, how do I get something, anything on paper that I can revisit.
Yeah.
And that sounds a little like clinical, but at the same time, it's better to me than sitting around being like, oh, I don't know what I'm going to write.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is kind of a theme that's come back up, is this idea of like letting go of expectations. And like, it is kind of about the action of it. Like, just like, don't put pressure on yourself. It doesn't have to be an amazing idea. Just get stuff down on paper, which seems to me like, well, this kind of brings me to just a quick little question that I want to ask you. I try to always get people's thoughts on this, but that kind of brings me to writer's block, right? Like, there's some people that think writer's block doesn't exist. It's not real. Some people who like talk about writer's block. But for you, I mean, you seem very productive. You seem like you're always coming up with ideas, working on so many different things. But this idea of like, just sit down and write 10 bad ideas. Would that be kind of the same type of advice you'd give someone who's just struggling to get anything on paper and just struggling with procrastination? That's a question we get all the time too. Like, how do I get past procrastination? But I'd love to get a little bit about your thoughts on like writer's block, procrastination. Do you have any like tactics or anything?
I think the thing that I force myself to do, let me tackle the procrastination thing first. When I started writing, there was definitely a procrastination element of it, but I knew that I wanted to finish these projects and I wanted to write them down. I wanted to finish the script for them at least. And what I told myself was, of all the things that can happen today, the only way that a script is not going to get done is if I don't jump into it. Anything I do with the computer open and typing is going to be moving me towards that goal. But anything where I'm just walking around and the computer's in a different room and I'm messing around or doing whatever, doing chores, the script is not going to get done when that happens. And so I just had to kind of force myself to be like, again, no expectations, just want to type out some stuff, even if it's a brainstorm. The other thing I do is, sometimes when you start a script, it can be really daunting, right? Yeah, let me back up, because I think that this actually, there's a moment here where I can talk about process that is a way that I can break down the way that I do it that might be helpful for some people.
I would love that.
Now, when you come up with an idea for a script or a TV show, sometimes you think, oh, Jesus, like I'm going to have to write 120 pages. This is really daunting. But what I try to do is I break off discrete tasks where I know I'm moving towards the goal, but not jumping in towards the goal, like into the goal itself. So when I come up with a movie idea, or even TV idea, any idea, what I do is I give myself permission to write 3 pages of just nonsense, meaning like nothing that has to even end up in the script. Thoughts about character, theme, why am I interested in this story? What are some cool things that you haven't seen before that maybe could go into the script? And I just allow myself to just write a huge scroll. Then I put it away and I say, all right, I'm not going to jump into doing 120 pages. I'm going to write 1 page that just tells the story very generally. Then I'll break that into a 4-pager where, like if it's a movie, then every page is, act 1, act 2A, act 2B, act 3. If it's a TV show, maybe I'll split it up every 3/4 of a page as an act. At that point, it's less daunting already. Then I say, okay, well, if it's a movie, let me write a 40-page outline. I know that that is overkill, but at the same time, I know that when I jump into the script, turning a 40-page outline into a movie script to me is a week. But it might take 2-3 weeks to do a 40-page outline. TV is the same way. I'll probably do like a 19-page outline for a 60-page script, 10-page outline for a 30-page script. But I think the idea is, even backing up further, because that is a very specific thing that I know that is good for me in terms of getting over writer's block. What I encourage writers who are starting out to do, as much as you're trying to put effort into the craft and a script, put the effort into knowing yourself and knowing what you need in order to get past certain things. There are many years where I would have this real tough anxiety about, God, am I doing the right thing? Should I switch tracks? Should I do this? And what I found was at the end of that anxiety, I always came up with a good idea. And so now I know that when I'm going through a really tough time, I know that there is something that's going to happen. I have to allow that to happen, feel all that anxiety. And at the end of it, I'll just be walking around and be like, oh, that's something I want to write. Wow. And that was a hard lesson, because you're in it. But But what I also say is that, projects are short term, but you as a writer, you're a long-term project. You are somebody who is going to have to know themselves in a certain way, because there's a lot of stuff that you can't necessarily control about the industry. But if you can control an understanding of who you are and what you need in order to be productive, I think that's a really important goal to set for yourself. And it's also just taking care of yourself, because there's a lot of stuff that happens in the industry that can be really hard. And you have to know yourself and know the way that you deal with it so that you can be healthy and productive.
Yeah, that is such a awesome breakdown. Like going, like we got to get that down on paper somehow. Like going
Sure.
from self-awareness, and then like learning what you need, and then just your steps for like outlining too, which I would love. I mean, I love the idea of start with, it's almost like just starting with pure creativity, getting on the page, then do a 4-page outline, then do a little bit of a longer one. That's such a good process. But when you're outlining, we can touch on this briefly, but when you're outlining, do you have like specific points that you think about, or just like any quick tips you have on what we can think about as we're trying to start to outline the bigger picture of the screenplay?
There are a number of things that I think about when I start a project, and some of them, and I'll try to attack them each individually and then try to weave them together. So there's a question of how you tell the story, and how to tell a story in a conceitful way that maybe people haven't seen before. But then even before that, it's why do I want to tell this story? What am I trying to say? But to me, it's not even that. That's one component of it, because that was a hypothesis of what I want to say. Because if I did that, then I wouldn't be learning anything. If I just start a project, think about what I want to say, and then I say it. It's really a thing about, I think this is what I want to say, but it's more about what are the questions I want to answer for myself through this process, and how to decode my feelings about the outside world, about this character, how I identify with this character, what are the issues that I want to think about for the next 3 to 6 months of my life. And those two components are really the driving parts of it. But then in addition to that, one of the things I do early on, it can be in that scroll of just ideas of like themes, what I want to explore, what are some interesting ways to tell the story. It's really, I find that once you start getting into the writing process, sometimes things get sanded down in a certain way because you start thinking about acts and cliffhangers. But for me, it's more, how do I put down in that very early stage 5 to 10 scenes that I've never seen before and I want to see in a movie or a TV show. And then I can always go back to it, because sometimes when you start to work out a story, it starts to be logistical. Whereas if you have that thing of like, oh God, I've never seen this type of scene before, and whatever happens, I want to try to get it into the script. Maybe it won't happen, but I just want to remind myself that that is a goal. And when you're really creatively free in those early parts of it where you're not thinking about the logistics of the screenplay, I find it's really nice to just have that stuff in there to remind yourself of like hitting those high notes.
Yeah, man, that's such good. I love how deep you go with this stuff. Like, I gotta say, your passion for this stuff is really invigorating. Like, you really like to go in there, like, and really get into the nitty gritty stuff. I really don't, like, I'm telling you, I've done so many of these interviews, and sometimes it's hard. Like, people kind of stay on the surface, but you're really like, that's just such a beautiful concept to think about, going even further back than like, what do I want to say with this? But decoding I love that that's what you said, like decoding yourself, which I'm like, God, that's such a good way to think about it. I love that. What do you think it is that has gotten you to have this particular like deeper philosophy of this craft? Like what kind of movie, like what are the things that influence you the most, that you think has been influencing you to go down this path of like really digging into this deeper stuff?
I've thought about it. I think that part of it was, and maybe this exists, maybe it doesn't even exist. Like, I sometimes think, I look at these directors and these writers who are really successful, and some part of me just wonders, like, do they just wake up and they just write a great script and then like become really successful? And there must be people out there who do that. I couldn't do that. I'm not able to do that thing where I just sit down, fully confident and just like write a thing and it's like great and well received. I really have to think about like, if something fails, I mean, I will say one of the things, and again, like I didn't think I started out as the most talented writer or director or any of those things. But one thing I do think was like a strength was like looking at myself and being like, what am I doing wrong? Not even what am I doing wrong, but like, why did this happen in a way that I didn't want it to happen? Like, why did this script not turn out the way I wanted it to turn out? And trying to be really self-critical and honest about myself and being okay with it. Being like, that script didn't turn out the way I wanted it to. Nobody's to blame but myself. What do I have to change in terms of my own internal thinking? When I was doing the short films, and this is just an example, you do 12 short films, you get to start to know what's working and what doesn't work. And what really happened was I was telling like really small personal idiosyncratic stories, or I was trying to do something that was like kind of didactic and political and genre, and none of them really worked. And I was like, well, I think I'm just not combining them correctly. And I need to give myself the freedom to not be as precious about everything I'm doing. So Window Breaker, the $600 short I shot over 2 weekends in Boston. My friends and I took the Chinatown bus down from New York. It was a personal story that had like a political backdrop to it. But I also wanted to stop myself from being so precious about every single word. So I was like, I know how these scenes will probably play out. I have a script, but I'm not going to show it to the actors. I'm going to just do outlines of every scene and what kind of happens and be really loose about it. And if there's any moment that feels fake, because I could tell that sometimes the thing that was in my head was not playing when I was shooting it. It just didn't work. And I thought it would, and then I wasn't backing off of it. I was like, I need to remove the safety net where I can look at a scene and try to be objective about it and not be locked into my own vision of what it should be, but almost like orchestrate it so it's hopefully something that feels really true and honest. And that was a short that got into Sundance.
Yeah.
So that was a really long answer to a question that I don't even remember why I started talking about.
This stuff, I'm telling you, like, I got to say, it's so refreshing talking to someone like you in this industry that is filled with a lot of negativity and filled with a lot of like kind of toxic competitiveness, and you seem to have, I don't want to assume, but you do seem to have like this, I mean, you love to help other people. I love what you do on Twitter and everything, but you have this like ability to self-reflect and not be hard on yourself, which is like one of those things that a lot of young writers or just young creatives really seem to struggle with. Do you have any tips or advice on just getting past self-doubt? Like, how can we not beat ourselves up when we start to procrastinate or when we start to fail? Like, what tips do you have there?
It's hard because when you're in that moment, I was in that moment, and I also feel like for a decade I was, oh God, why can't I get my projects off the ground? Why doesn't anybody care about the stuff that I'm making? And honestly, it's just really, really hard during that time. And I think the main thing I would say to myself, if I was looking back on it, and part of me wanting to alleviate some of the doubt and pain from younger filmmakers is, again, I just remember how hard those times were, is, I look at somebody who made 2 features when they were in high school, made another 2 features when they were in college, made 11 short films, 12 short films before one got into Sundance. And I think, like, if I were to look back on it and give that person advice, I would be saying, you're doing the right thing. You can't see that you're doing the right thing right now, but you're getting better. Everything that you're doing is getting better each time. You're the things that you are doing that are not working out, and you're trying to fix them. And it's really tough, and I sometimes, on Twitter, I'm very, very open about what those times were like and trying to support filmmakers who are like really out there doing it, making short films. Like, again, like if you're out there, you're writing scripts and you're doing that every day, like there's not really a bad outcome that's going to come out of it, but it just can take some time and it can be really hard when you're in it.
Yeah. Well, I love that. I think that's the best advice right there. What you just said, just you're in it and you're doing it. And even just something that I think about is like the statistics of like how many people give up, like you said, after their first thing. So if you're just, even if you're just continuing to go and you're not quite seeing the success yet, but you're still going, I feel like if we can somehow attach to that as a win and as a way to motivate ourselves, I would love to talk a little bit about like how you got so engaged on Twitter. Like what was like, what kind of drew you in to start to do what you're doing, like helping people and really shining a light and being so supportive, and just any thoughts on Twitter right now? We all know things are kind of crazy over there, but like what kind of got you started with being so active and engaged,
So I was not really very on social when I moved out to LA and I started working in writers' rooms. I was in a show called Once Upon a Time for a couple of years, and those writers were very active on Twitter. So I knew what it was. And I knew that, the fan base was on there. But it was really around the time when I was on Gotham, where I think it's really, when you're in a TV writer's room, the funny thing about it is it's really easy to kind of feel jaded and like you're going in there every day. You're doing, I was in network TV, so I was doing 22 episodes, 23 episodes a year. And sometimes it's just like you feel like you're just in a factory and you're making stuff. And even though if I loved working on Once Upon a Time, working on Gotham. But then I remember going to Comic-Con and showing, clips from the shows and being like, wow, there's like a fan base here. This stuff is so meaningful to them. And I need to like remind myself about why people love these shows. Because when you're in this like echo chamber of like, you're in a writer's room and you think that people are responding to this or that and the other, or you're looking at the ratings, it's not the same as being on social and looking and seeing what the fans are saying about the show.
Yeah.
And, I really loved Gotham had a very big like LGBTQ fan base, and seeing how meaningful those relationships were them, even when they were like non-canon, like that was really meaningful to me because I really liked writing those characters and the love that people felt for those characters. It was a good way for me to stay active and engaged and to not be like, all right, I'm going to the office to write an episode of TV. It was like, I'm going to the office and I want to create something that like people are really excited about. It's like really meaningful to them. Like I had never really understood the depth of like, at the time it was called like Stan Twitter, and like people just like going crazy over things that, you just write into a script. And it was really wonderful for me to interact with the community and know that like I saw them and I appreciated them. And that was really the start of it. And then as things went on, I was promoting the comic book company that I co-founded, TKO Presents, a lot on Twitter. And I was learning how to use it then. And then I just kind of found that, there were people who are very visible on Twitter who are very successful, but then there's also a lot of folks who are starting out and trying to get a foothold in the industry. And I felt that having come into the industry as an outsider, I didn't know anybody who had worked in the industry. It wasn't like my family worked in film or TV or were producers or anything. I found that the industry is so opaque and it's so hard to get real answers on a lot of things, whether that is even as simple as like the process that somebody uses to write a screenplay, or what are some things about the industry that are really tough that you wouldn't know until you were fully through that gauntlet.
Yeah.
And I also just felt like I wanted to help people who were maybe not born into the industry or could not, spend 4 years working in the mailroom of agency because their parents were paying their rent. Like I wanted to level the playing field a certain way. And so I wanted to talk about the industry in a way that was like optimistic, because I do feel a lot of optimism about the industry, but also very truthful, but also truthful about like what I had experienced in terms of things that were pain points, things that were hard for me, because I wish that when I was coming up, there was somebody who was like, listen, these are some things that are going to be very hard. I don't want to sugarcoat it for you, but if you can do it and you can stomach it, you can succeed, but it's not going to happen unless you go through some of these very painful things. And just to know that listen, if I can post something like that and it gets 4,000 likes, 4,000 people, 5,000, 10,000 people read about it, and I'm alleviating that pain for like however many thousands of people in that moment, like very happy to do it. And that was really like inspiring to me to be able to do that.
I mean, no wonder it's so refreshing talking to you about this stuff, because we love what you do there. And it is beautiful that you're trying to break down those barriers and you're trying to shine a light on the reality of this industry and how hard it can be. Like you said, it's so opaque. And that kind of leads me, I know we're starting to run out of time. But just quickly, I'd love to like briefly get a little bit of thoughts on like your short film got into Sundance. That was like, I'm assuming like a new level of like validation, you know. But what were some of those, like, what was, I guess I'm just trying to get at, like, what tips do you have for people? They've written a lot, they've done a lot, they've made shorts, they're confident in their talent, they feel like they're good, but what tips do you have? Like, what are the practical next steps for breaking into this opaque industry? Like, what things can we start doing today, especially with Twitter, with social media platforms? Like, just any quick advice you have for some steps we can start taking.
Breaking into the industry?
Yeah, I guess so. Or networking, like just kind of getting that momentum, you know?
Yeah. You know, it's a good question. You know, I think that the access to people right now is really open. You know, if you make a short film and you love it, you know, putting it on Vimeo and talking about it on Twitter, and also just coming up with like a community of people who are, you know, I think at this level that you're at, and also all working together on trying to, like, you know, break into the industry, sharing information. You know, it's funny that you bring up the short film, because I will also say that when I went to Sundance, there was the feeling of, okay, now I've gotten my foot in the door. And the feeling of, you know, they accept 70 short films out of like 6,000 submissions. And at the time I was like, wow, this is really going to be the first step. And there's going to be a lot of meetings that come out of this. I like can make this path easier. Didn't really happen. And I think that one of the expectations is when something happens and there is recognition, that you'll be handed things. And what I just want to say, in order to be realistic for folks, is that that never really happens as long as you are trying to come up with that next thing, because it's always a different level. And for me, you know, every time that there's been something that hasn't really been the expectation that I've wanted it to be, especially early on, it was disappointing. One thing that I was good at was identifying what the problem was with my expectation versus the reality and trying to change that. So I'll give an example. You know, when I went to Sundance with my short, nobody cared. You know, I was like, you know, they showed the short. Everyone was like, oh, this is great. No meetings. I got like, maybe I had like one meeting back in New York afterwards. But in that moment, I said, okay, well, I understand now. It's not that someone's going to hand me something, but I have this credit where I have this short at Sundance. I need to use this credit to do the next thing, but I can't stop being proactive. And so I wrote a feature that was very close to the short in terms of the tone. And I lowered the budget so much that I was like, I'm going to shoot it for $20,000.
Wow.
And it's going to happen no matter what. And I met with some producers that were like, don't make it for $20,000. Let's make it for like 150K. And that's what I did, because I knew that that was a level of entry that was going to be really easy for people to process. But it was the same way when I came out to LA to do TV. And I sold my first pilot when I came out here, but you know, it didn't get picked up. And the shows that I was in competition with, you know, all those folks had decades of experience running TV writers' rooms. And I understood that. I realized that I had to be patient and to change my perception of, you know, I felt like I'd done it. I sold my first pilot. That's like a really big deal. But then I was like, it's not enough. What's going to make it enough is if I have more experience, which is why I told my agents I wanted to staff on 100 episodes of TV. And so I did 5 years of network TV, and I did that. And then when I came out of that, I said, now I feel confident that I can walk back into a room. It was like, you know, 5 years ago, I didn't know how to answer a lot of the questions. And now I know, like, if I sell a pilot, I can run that show from beginning to end. But it was a hard lesson, because at the time it was very disappointing. But yeah, I think trying to be honest with yourself about what you could be doing differently, and trying to be very fluid in your mindset of how you like perceive yourself.
Yeah. And just, you know, I think it's a really powerful mindset that kind of has come up in this interview, and I really appreciate just that the idea that it isn't going to be handed to you, and you have to be proactive, and you can't settle. Like no matter what that next level is, you always have to keep being proactive, and that's the same no matter what level you're at, right? When you're doing
Sure.
things like what you're doing. And I know we have like maybe 10 minutes, but I would love to hear a little bit about your current projects right now. Gremlins, Secret of Mogwai, and then I'm a Virgo, comic book TKO Productions. Like, I know that that's a lot for 10 minutes, but I gotta say,
Oh yeah, totally.
Gremlins, like, the animation looks so cool on that show. Like, is that a new type of animation or something? Like, I feel like I've never seen that type of animation before, and it's so interesting. And I would love to just hear a little bit about how that project came to be.
So again, just being like very trying to break down the process. There's a lot of like being proactive and then putting yourselves into places where it's like all of a sudden like the luck kind of happens. And for Gremlins, I was coming off of Gotham. We knew that Gotham was going to have their last season. So that was also a gift in that, like, we were like, we can wrap up the storylines. And I knew that I wanted to look for my next thing. And I wanted to try to sell a show. And I felt confident about it. I'd been in these writers' rooms for 5 years. And, the really great thing about Gotham was my showrunner, John Stevens, really, he would always say this thing that I always say to the people that worked in my writers' rooms is, he was like, listen, I want you to do this because when you run your own show, you should know how to do it. And he had me go into every studio and network notes call. He was like, you lead the meeting because when you run your own show, you should know how to do it. And I'm like eternally thankful for him for that. And he also did a thing where he double bumped me the last year, which was I skipped a level. So I went from, I think, co-producer to supervising producer. And I think that kind of sent a message to Warner Brothers, who produced Gotham, that like I was important in the writer's room. But I was just grinding, I was just like doing my best on these TV shows and really trying to like make every episode as good as it could be. And what happens is like you end up on a list of like Warner Brothers, like approved writers that like they want to keep working with. And when they were looking for somebody to do this prequel to Gremlins, I think Warner Brothers had a list, and then Amblin was there as well. And I had dinner with, this is a little bit of a long story, but it just goes to show the kind of synchronicity of some of this stuff. I had dinner with a high school friend, and his boyfriend worked at Amblin. So when I think the Warner Brothers exec, Audrey Deal, who was amazing, was reading through the names, Clint, who was my buddy's boyfriend, now husband, was like, oh, I know that guy. Let's bring him in. But it's the kind of thing where if I had not had all those years of experience running rooms, I wouldn't have been able to go in with as much confidence. And I went in, and they were very respectful. They said, we're bringing in a few people. We don't want you to come up with a whole pitch. Just talk to us about what you like about this concept. And I came in and talked a lot about my childhood and the spirits and creatures that from Chinese mythology that I grew up with, a lot of like my personal connection with Gremlins. And I wanted to do it as like an Amblin-esque adventure with like kids, but with life or death stakes. Things like, Goonies or the original Gremlins movies. It's kind of a DNA of early Amblin that I grew up loving. And one of the things I talked about as well was wanting it to feel really cinematic. The way that they move the camera in those Amblin movies, obviously Spielberg, but, Richard Donner and Goonies, that opening sequence of Goonies, like the camera tells that story so beautifully. And in order to do that, we needed to create a technology that was kind of 2.5D, meaning that the characters were CG, but the backgrounds were kind of like paintings that were laid on top of the architecture. And what that allows you to do is to move the camera around the characters in a way that like kind of can simulate some of that Amblin-esque like kind of like epic visuals that we kind of have come to know and love. And the other thing I wanted to do was the word CG really scared me, because having seen CG animation, like a lot of that stuff can age very quickly. And I wanted to create something that would stand the test of time. And so we worked together with our supervising producer, Dan Kroll, and our art director, Tara Ruping, to create textures on all the characters that felt very like handmade. So even with the CG characters, like there's brush strokes, like in the clothing, like it's almost painted. And movies like Spirited Away were obviously like influences on the show.
Yeah, and no wonder it looks so beautiful. That's what you can see the influence from like Spielberg, Amblin, like you can totally see it. And yeah, that makes sense. Why I'm like, this animation style looks so like interesting. Like I've never seen this before, but I would love to hear a little bit. I mean, we have like 5 minutes. I could talk to you for another hour, but can you tell me a little bit about TKO Studios and working in the comic book medium? We have a lot of people that like to do adaptations that want to get into like adapting known IPs. And so I would love to just hear a little bit about how that came to be and the process for working in that medium.
The company was started by me and my co-founder, Sal Simeone. Sal and I met through, it's actually a really bizarre story. It's actually I wrote and directed an episode of Little America for Apple. I directed, I think, the 6th or 7th episode called The Grand Prize Expo Winners. And it's autobiographical. It's about my mom and when we were teenagers and we won a cruise. And so if you watch that episode, you see us winning the cruise, and it's also about like the way she grew up, and it cuts back and forth from, the past and the present. And, but on that cruise is where I met my best friend, and my business partner is my best friend's dad. And, he was always somebody who really believed in me, even when I was a teenager. And when I, started working in film, he was always like, well, if you want to make a movie, I will, invest in it. And I would always say to him, please do not invest in a movie ever. Do not invest in my movies or anybody's movies. It's a really risky proposition. And I think he appreciated that I was so real with him about that, even though at the time, obviously I would love for someone to finance a movie that I was doing. And then when I was working on Once Upon a Time, I was going from having directed 2 movies. One was at Sundance, one released by Sony, to being a staff writer. So being at the very bottom of the totem pole again. And I felt like there was a moment where I was worried that I would just staff on TV shows for the rest of my life. And I wanted to do something that was entrepreneurial, that felt like I was putting together something from scratch, like I did in independent film. And I'd always been a comic book fan, obviously. And I called my co-founder, the CEO of TKO, and I said, instead of financing a movie, maybe we should do a slate of comic books. I think we're in a golden age creatively of comics. There's really interesting creators working right now. And he did the thing where, he's very successful. He's an entrepreneur. He's founded like 12 different companies. And he pushed me to create a vision for the company that was much bigger than I initially thought. And we launched 5 years ago. We have books by superstar creators like Garth Ennis, who created The Boys, Jeff Lemire, who did Sweet Tooth, Roxane Gay. And we have about 60 works in our library right now. And the idea is to really protect the creators financially and creatively. And when it moves into an adaptation, we produce the adaptations of it. And to create a comic book company that's also a vertically integrated studio that goes all the way through production. Probably won't handle distribution for anything in the near future, but that vision for the company was something that I'd always loved comics, but Sal and I worked together. I learned a lot from him in terms of business, but also just like leadership. He, like I said, sits on the board of 12 companies and always has time for me. And it's like, he taught me a lot about leadership and self-reflection. And I frankly don't know that I could run shows the way that I do had I not learned a lot of that stuff from him.
Wow. I mean, that's unbelievable. Just building that. Like, do you ever look back and think about that kid in high school making features with your friends to creating this studio? That's unbelievable. Just in this hour that we've chatted, to hear that journey, like, God, that's amazing. That really is. I think,
one of the things I also tell people who are starting out, because it can feel daunting, right? You direct a feature film or you showrun a TV show, budget of like many tens of millions of dollars. But at the end of the day, the job is not different than if you're making a short film or you're writing script. Like the job is the same. You're just making the best creative choices that you can given the limitations. And so in some ways it just feels like I'm doing like a bigger version or a continuation of, that thing that I did. And also, by the way, when you work on a streaming TV show with a crew of like 400 people, you don't have to do everything. It gets a lot easier because you can just focus on the creative side of things. Whereas, I was making movies in high school, like calling someone's parent to be like, I know he's grounded, but like we're all waiting for him to shoot this one scene. I only have the camera for like 4 more hours. But at the end of the day, the job is the same, and it's the same. You're still the same person making the same creative choices. And I also want to like demystify the process in that, like, if you're out doing that, if you're writing scripts and making short films, like when you move to that next level and the level after that and the level after that, you are doing the same thing. So you have the tools that you need at this moment to pull that all the way through.
Well, that's probably a good place to end it. That is an amazing like last quote. Just it's about making those creative choices, at whatever level you're doing it. That's a beautiful way to think about it. And thank you so much for doing this. I feel reinvigorated now. Like okay. I gotta just go jump straight to writing right after this call. So thank you so much for doing this. And of course, we'd love if we can, do another interview at some point and maybe talk a little bit more about your projects in depth. But I got a lot out of this, and I know people in our community are going to get a lot out of this too. So Thank you so much.
No, this was really fun. And it's always nice to talk to somebody who's like very invested in like, the process and like illuminating the process for other people.
Yeah, well, that's what we're trying to do here. Just trying to motivate. Seems like you're doing the same thing. So thank you so much.
Awesome. All right. Thanks so much.